Over the last 2 days, we've talked a lot about what coworking will look like, be it in the post-COVID world, be it through coworking owners, coworking operators, through the real estate perspective, interior design. We've also involved coworkers. And when we thought about the program, we're like, but what does the research say about coworking? And this is why I'm really delighted to wrap up the event with this great panel discussion. We are actually today going to have two great researchers, Tuukka Toivonen, who is a PhD researcher from Oxford University, but right now based in Japan. Let's welcome him on stage. Hi, Tuukka. Can you hear me?
Hi, Pauline. Hi, everyone. Hello.
How are you?
I'm very good. Happily here in Japan now, and it looks like it's summer. Very pleased to join you here on this final day. Yeah, excited
and we are really
be here.
Happy to have you here because you were also involved last year in Coworking in the physical event. So it's great to have you here for a second time. Let's also welcome Manuel, who is in Prague, so not too far away from me. Hi, Manuel. How are you?
Hello, good morning. I'm doing really good. I'm happy to be here, and an amazing trophy, I have to say. I'm really curious who takes it away.
Yeah, it's we also really like it, and I'm also curious to see who will get it. I'll keep you posted. So let's dig right now into our topic. When we defined the talk of that we are going to have today, the three of us, we said, okay, let's talk about the added value of coworking, but can we start by defining exactly what should be the definition, like value for coworking? What is it, in your opinion?
Okay, I can say a few words first. I guess I come from a more sociological background, just to sort of put that out there. But value, of course, it's a loaded word, right? Which is good and bad. So it means lots of things for a lot of people. For me personally, it's really about the value enjoyed by the individual members and the teams that join co-working spaces, that make use of them in their day-to-day work. So I really focus on the user, I guess, in my research. And you could say it's the intangible and tangible benefits that these people get from participating in a co-working community in the context of their own journeys. So I have trouble with sort of thinking about a universal measure of value, although the word itself is very useful because it's so widely understood or recognized. But I like to try to put this idea of value in the context of individual journeys and specific spaces as well. I can talk about creative value at it a bit later, but that's essentially how I would respond in the first instance to this question.
How about you, Manuel?
I can fully agree with Tuukka, and I think Tuukka is the expert here on value and his kind of quest to measure value. The research that I've been involved in kind of starts a bit earlier, perhaps, in a sense of looking at talent and understanding actually who and how such a value can be added. So it's more the actor that adds the value, whereas Tuukka looks more into what that value actually means. So I think it complements each other actually quite well.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because oftentimes I think for co-working spaces it's difficult to understand how they can frame their value or how they can even like put into words what their real value is. And I think even defining it for them is not always obvious because they do it out of passion or out of needs, and sometimes putting that into a concrete sentence of, okay, what kind of value do I bring to my members is kind of like difficult to put together. So how can we help co-working spaces to define their value in your own perspective?
I guess, Manuel, do you want to go first? That's a massive question. Really
it is. I was just just had to process it for a second.
I'm giving you a lot of brain work for 9 a.m. in the morning, Manuel.
I'm glad I had my coffee already, so that's good. Well, how can they add? I think to a certain extent, it first starts off by actually really understanding what that value is that they are aiming at. And then from my perspective, in terms of talent and talent management, I think it's about understanding how you can set the relevant frameworks in place. So it's providing everything in terms of structures, in terms of mechanisms to have these in place in order to actually allow for such a value to be added in the first place. because it's one element that there are people who might potentially add value. But I think a major key here is to actually understand how that value can be contributed to the community and how you can ensure that this is facilitated, that this is something that occurs much more likelier.
Yeah.
And so in that regard, I think it's really a long-term focus. It's a continuous process of always rethinking and understanding again how your initial definition of perhaps value, or the value that you're aiming for, continues to change with the people that you have in the space, which is also changing all the time, and always tailoring what you do to the specific member base to really ensure that this is something that can happen and be maximized on a long-term perspective. So that's kind of my take on it. What about you, Tuukka?
I would tend to agree with this idea that it's a dialogue, right? It's an ongoing dialogue. It has to be, right? Because the industry doesn't stay or stand still, and nor do communities stand still. So it's great to have a process for that dialogue. In a couple of articles in the past, I've said the value of co-working is multidimensional. So, and we have to accept that, and that's why it's a huge challenge, because it could be about well-being, it could be about making progress with your commercial connections, it could be about learning new skills. So I think on that side, it needs to be a dialogue between different disciplines as well, and I think that obviously takes time to come together. But in our sort of recent research on these creative journeys of early stage entrepreneurs in London, we wanted to make it really tangible. Well, insofar that you can make intangible things tangible. We wanted to kind of zoom into examples, and these would be conversations between early stage entrepreneurs. There was a lady who was a sort of therapist, voice therapist, and she had great discussions with her mentors and ended up kind of shifting her focus from therapy to well-being. So she chose well-being kind of as her new market, kind of as her new framing. So you could see how her path changed through these interactions within the co-working space. Something very important happened, something substantial with consequences to the direction of her business. So we try to kind of zoom into these moments, often very inspirational moments, and where something shifts. And if you're able to do that, you can actually use that also for your messaging, for your marketing, but you can then take it to a slightly more, I guess, an academic or evaluative context and see, okay, who's having these moments? When are they happening? Who's not having them? And who is really not getting the value they want to the extent that they're thinking of leaving? So you could also focus on the failures, or the kind of these instances where nothing is happening, so the member just feels a huge lack of value. But yeah, it's a big picture. And I'd really agree with Manuel, it's a dialogue. But it's great when you're able to find those moments when the value is actualized.
Would you, one thing I always find interesting, because like we visited together with Dimitar and with Cowork is more than 400 co-working spaces. And for me, it also comes down to the experience, like defining your value. The value you want to add to people is also somehow linked to the experience you offer to the coworkers, or even people who are using your space, just let's say for an event, or coming just for networking, or whatever they do inside the space. Would you agree to that? Like that there is somehow a correlation between experience that you offer and value creation or value added?
Well, I think that's what you should be aiming for to an extent. If that correlation is always in place, I guess is another question. But I think with time going by and you kind of drawing your learning perhaps from past events where maybe you see that the fit is really not given, you're not adding what you perhaps intended to, drawing the learning from that and perhaps improving for the future. I think this is what you should be aiming for, to maximize that correlation perhaps.
I think I would agree with a lot of things I've heard you say in the past, that co-working is incredibly diverse as a field and should be diverse. So therefore, you can imagine spaces, and indeed, I'm sure you've been to many, that really emphasize experience, right? The experiential side, having really, lavish breakfasts on a Monday morning, doing, quiet discos in the afternoon, and yoga and well-being and all that. It depends, I guess, what you mean by experience. So if you mean it in these terms of like experience design, then yeah, that's great. And recently I've come in contact with this field of ritual design, so which is sort of fairly up and coming in the kind of art school world. So you can kind of imagine how certain routines or events could be very carefully designed as rituals, where there's perhaps a bit of a singing going on at the start. All kinds of unusual experiential elements are employed to make people feel closer and to kind of mobilize their creativity. It could be physical movement, or it could be just different ways of maybe having food together, cooking, and so forth. So I think there's that kind of experiential design side, which is great. If you're talking about user experience, then that's a different concept. But yeah, I would tend to agree with you. And going back to Manuel's point on it being a dialogue, right? So value measurement and assessment being a dialogue, then there's a question of, do your users expect that? Because some would be coming to co-working for just enhancing their day-to-day lives, right? Having happier lives, feeling more effective, efficient, focused on their work, whereas others would expect kind of a no-frills experience. I just want my desk, I want my coffee perhaps, I want some business connections, but that's all. So I guess it goes back to the dialogue question, and then to the question of diversity in the field, right? It's wonderful to have this scale of approaches, and I wonder if that kind of answers the question or not.
It does, definitely. And actually, it's a great bridge to my next question. So thank you, Tuukka, for that. Because now we are talking about value, we defined it. Another question that viewers and co-working spaces might wonder is like, but how should I measure my value, and also why should I measure it? What's your take on that?
Maybe Tuukka, you can go ahead and maybe just add a bit about the measuring part. That's what your expertise is.
I won't speak for very long on this, but and certainly there's no hegemonic right. There's no hegemonic sort of correct answer. But I would always encourage spaces to work with experts to run diagnostics. So do kind of a short-term diagnostic survey to kind of do a mapping of where this value is being experienced. And usually we would divide it, especially in my work with Lucy Hackshaw, who may be following this from Flux, we would divide our work into kind of well-being, looking at well-being variables and experiences, and then looking at sort of commercial value, pointing to these interactions where an entrepreneur or a freelancer feels that they've made progress along their journey, they've cracked a problem, or they found a new market, or whatever. So we would sort of divide it into those, and then do an assessment with a small number of members on when they experience value, and then we try to understand, what are the factors facilitating those connections, and who is not experiencing that kind of value. So it's multidimensional. It could be much broader than that. You could even imagine mapping out, stress levels if you wanted to go that direction. So that kind of reminds us that how you measure value depends on your own values, I guess, and your strategic priorities. So if you really want to make your startups grow very quickly, then you're really going to focus on commercial value and look at instances of sort of mutual support and new networks, connections, and so forth. If you're focused on well-being, you might measure levels of stress, levels of happiness, and there are luckily a lot of existing sort of academic measurements that are out there that one can draw on. So that's a few things on the first question. I'm going to hand it over to Manuel so that it won't be my monologue. Then we can come back to the question of why they should measure value, right? Why co-working actors should measure value.
Thank you, Tuukka. That actually fit brilliantly into the research that I've been involved in now on talent management, where we were looking into 20 co-working spaces in the Visegrad countries. It was funded by the Visegrad Fund as well, and I was working, among others, with my colleague Marco Orel, who maybe also is watching. So hi to you. But what really kind of emerged from that is what Tuukka was just saying that they need to understand, first of all, what they're looking for in a sense of positioning their brand on the market, because this is the key, say, first step, where afterwards they can then determine whether there is a match. And this is also a crucial thing that came up from most of the spaces, actually, that the awareness of the needs of their members is one of the key characteristics that help them, or say the key tools in a sense, to advance their core space and always ensure that they can maintain their competitive edge. And there are so many different tools, and what you measured, Tuukka, already kind of highlighted already before. But it may be through informal chats, just understanding what's going on, what do they need. It might be through surveys, to just get a snapshot of the moment, perhaps take some additional measures and see again whether there is something that is working. And I think for members also, it provides a nice feeling, because you see that your co-working space cares. They are interested in how you feel, and they want to ensure that you actually feel better, which I think further perhaps facilitates this community building and them self-identifying with this brand very much. Maybe that's something that you've also observed, Pauline, while
Yes,
seeing all these co-working spaces.
Yeah, actually, before jumping into the hack co-working and co-workers journey, I was also running a co-working space myself in Berlin. And one of the ways that was really helping us to measure value was through surveys with members of various sorts. Some were really simple, and I think those were more to measure the happiness, as I would call it, of the space itself, but also of the community. And one was a bit longer that we were sending like every half a year to also understand how they were feeling with the space as a whole. So not just like the cleanliness and everything, but more like, okay, what do you get out of it and what would you like to get more? And I really agree to the point that it's not something that co-working, like value, defining your value and measuring it is not something they can do by themselves. It's definitely a conversation that they should have with their members, with their team as well. Because I also believe that co-working space it's a human business, so it all comes down to the team that runs it. And as we were talking about the experience before, also, Tuukka, you rightfully mentioned it, like be it the user experience, but also the design you craft around that space. That also comes down to the team that makes it happen. You know, like so for me, I really believe that measuring it comes into having this dialogue with everybody that's involved around your space. It can also be your investors, for instance, if you have any investors.
So it's essentially, if I understand correctly, it's essentially involving all of the relevant stakeholders to narrow down not only whether you should measure, but what you should measure actually.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's a great point. I fully agree.
Yeah, maybe that links up with the question of why should smaller co-working players specifically measure their value, right? Because the larger ones, of course, they have a battery of sort of in-house researchers in some cases, or they have sort of quality teams and so forth. And the smaller players, often because they're very busy, I think, with operational issues and running their spaces, they don't necessarily see why they should measure value. And that's obviously a challenge, a good challenge for people like myself to sort of be forced to really explain the value of value, I guess, the value of trying to measure. And this is, and I would be the last person to say that measuring value is the be all and end all, or the solution to everything. It's not. It's just a way to pursue a more informed discussion about how you can better serve your stakeholders, right, and users. But one thing I'm really quite passionate about is this kind of the diversity of the field, because I wouldn't want it to become a field of sort of Googles and Amazons and the WeWorks and so forth. So there's kind of a more, I guess, a macro level reason where, you know, if the smaller players can really articulate and evidence their value, you know, that diversity can be better protected. And what that means is that more diverse needs will be served and can be served in a kind of more niche way, right? So I think that's wonderful, and that's kind of going to guard or protect and nourish the innovativeness of the field. So if you can kind of show that we are doing something, or let's say it's very special with childcare and creativity in our space, then that gives you a profile, and that then directs the right people to come to you, hopefully. So perhaps that's kind of more of a bigger reason. I don't know if you have any comments on this, Pauline and Manuel.
I think what's interesting on what you said, Tuukka, and I like it because it links also the research that Manuel has been carrying, is that I see the value of co-working spaces going beyond just their walls. Co-working spaces have a real impact, and they add tremendous value in any place where they are. So whether it's a co-working space that is in a big city like London or like Tokyo or Prague, or if it's a remote co-working space on the countryside or in more like, let's say, a seaside type of place, there is always value that co-working spaces create the moment they open their doors. And that goes through the people they attract also. And this is where your research is focusing on, right, Manuel?
Yes, to a certain extent, absolutely. So when we were looking into this, then we first identified a kind of continuum of co-working spaces, either having a stronger business focus, so perhaps focusing more on maximizing the extraction of talent that can happen, working closer with investors and so forth. So this is more the, say, larger co-working spaces, perhaps, and global chains. On the other hand, we had very much of a community focus, so that is more what Tuukka just called the smaller, perhaps independent co-working spaces that are catering to the needs of a niche, perhaps. And this is a third called of say dimension that came up, which is that of the wider community. So they really focus on the local context, and they contribute to that, and they work together with them. And I think it's a beautiful thing when co-working spaces are not only creating value for their members, but actually for the wider field of people who are actually not even related to the co-working space itself. In some cases, they were calling this to perhaps help make a social impact, to initiate social changes, working with local companies and incorporating these elements. And I think it's absolutely nice. And I think in that case, understanding the value that you're adding is a great opportunity, actually, because it allows you to more accurately, say, position your co-working space on the market, and making sure that the niche that you want to cater to is also understood by externals, that you are the one who is catering to that particular niche. Because in many of the larger cities, especially, I think I can only speak for Prague, where I see it right outside my door, essentially. There are a lot of global players tapping into the market, and it, to a certain extent, forces the independent co-working spaces to think about what they're doing and to also focus on these elements. So as much as it might be perceived as a threat, I would very much like to encourage smaller spaces to see this much more as an opportunity, and to just get familiar with actually what they're really doing.
Yeah, on that note, sorry. I was just gonna add something that we often say at Coworkies to just re-emphasize your point, Manuel, is that, and what Tuukka was also saying at the beginning of our conversation, which is the diversity of co-working. And 2 days ago, when there was the co-working symposium where you participated, Manuel, that was organized by Marco, who I hope is watching us, I talked about this diversity of co-working and the fact that it's not so much like about competition, because as we say often at co-working is a dish where everybody adds just like different spices on it. So if in a city like Prague you have very big players, they won't do it the same way as the smaller ones. So for me, like, this diversity is also needed in order to create even more value, because then you serve a larger audience and a larger crowd. So then suddenly the value of co-working becomes like way more than it was when there was only just one co-working space.
That's a beautiful analogy, and I also think that for potential co-working space members, it's very nice because they can really find what perfectly fits to what they are understanding for co-working, and I think it then adds to the individual communities much more, because there's just much more of a fit depending on what you like.
Just to correct, the quote is, co-working is the same dish, everyone cooks differently. This is what we say.
I like this version as well, though.
And I think it should be kept that way. I mean, not to say that that the bigger players don't have their role, but usually it's probably the smaller players that can effectively build local networks that really span their boundaries. So they go beyond being a bubble for their own members, right? And I think there's some measures for the kind of hard economic value that a lot of these local hubs are creating, and that's wonderful and that's necessary. One place where there is a bit of a gap, I think, is in trying to demonstrate the intangible value of these kinds of local places. And we are working with the British Council now to look into creative hubs in the Philippines and sort of try to pinpoint to the moment where these new projects are initiated, for instance, between the public sector, private sector actors and all that. And then we try to sort of provide episodes or evidence on what the co-working spaces are doing in that process. So I think there's a similar need there, whether you're within this broader network context or within just the member space, to kind of, try to uncover the intangible value. And we kind of share this with certain colleagues. We share this concern that it has been a big challenge to really point out and flesh out the intangible value. We just had a discussion with Janet Merkel, who's also a big sort of defender of the local hubs. But yeah, the attention seems to go to the bigger economic indicators. And I do believe it's a huge priority to try to focus on the intangibles. Just one more point about why it's nice to focus on value, and this was inspired a little bit by Gabriela Hersham from Huckletree. So I was just listening to a podcast of her thinking about how Huckletree can really survive and thrive through this crisis. And she was sort of signaling and emphasizing their mission, that they are turning a lot more to their sort of broader mission as opposed to, I guess, their membership numbers or immediate economic indicators and so forth. And they were starting to ask themselves about, okay, aren't we here also for the well-being of our members? Is there some experiential element to what we're providing? What is the ultimate mission that we're trying to serve? And she was kind of suggesting that if you take the discussion up one level, you make it a little bit more abstract, you kind of become more resilient, or more options open up to you as managers, right? Because you're not so fixated on the everyday operational stuff, and you're able to perhaps reframe or reconceive your mission. And if your mission is to be a well-being community for diverse entrepreneurs, let's say from minority backgrounds, you can serve that mission through different methods. And if it suddenly becomes very difficult to maintain a physical space, which obviously is a huge source of stress at this time, I understand, for many players, if needed, you can kind of move away from that and say, our mission is still intact. This is the kind of value we want to produce. We have a value perspective, a shared value perspective. We're not fixated and tied to a particular space, although that has been a sort of platform for our community. But we're now going to be a bit flexible, but we're going to remain committed to our mission and our values and the value we're producing. So there's that kind of more, I guess, a strategic benefit to thinking in terms of value. And I'm sure many spaces are doing this at the very moment, as we speak here. But it's great to be able to go up one level and then go down one level to look at the tangible benefits yet again, and you get what I mean. But I find that perspective inspiring as well.
And so now that we define what's the value, how and why co-working spaces can measure it, what about maximizing the value? So what's your take on helping co-working spaces to maximize their value? How can they do that?
From the research that we've been conducting, I think there are two major elements that fit into the co-working space itself. One is talent mediation, and the second is actually the way that you organize the space. And maybe let me talk about talent mediation first. And I would be happy to also hear your thoughts on this. Obviously, I don't want to just hold a lecture here. But what really came up for us is the way that the co-working space acts in a way of trying to mediate between the talented people in the space. So we all know this. We might be new in a space. Perhaps we're a bit shy. We don't really know what the others are actually doing, what they're up to, also in their professional lives. And this is where the coworking space can come in with their team, with community managers, with owners, and so forth, and try to connect the dots, really, because it might be that you're looking for somebody to join your project. It might be looking for a new employee, and you don't know that they're actually sitting just a few meters away from you, because you might not have this conversation. So trying essentially to facilitate the mediation between talents. That can be done in an actively mediated way. Say the community manager says, hey, I know this guy, that's exactly who you need, let me connect you to. Or just providing opportunities for this to happen more organically, maybe through events where communities the community gets together, they get to know each other. It might be through setting up systems, talent pools where people can communicate. I'm sure, Pauline, you will have some great insight for this as well. And yeah, just really trying to ensure that what we were discussing before, the people who have this innate talent, like Tuukka was describing the case before, that they are actually able to perceive that, to see that, and to unlock it and actually go ahead with it. So the talent that they might not even be aware of, but they can grow just from this interaction that is happening in that particular space. So talent mediation as an absolute crucial factor. And the second element that we've seen is how you organize the space, in a sense of how you set up the physical space as well, and the policies, the management of it. May it be through the resource provision, that everything is there. One of the interviewees actually was saying that they are providing the fishing rod and the bait, and the coworking space members, they do the rest. They are going on to catch the big fish, but really that everything is there for them, and that it's organized in a sense that they don't have to worry about anything, and all these positive benefits can be reaped because it's all somewhat provided there. And I just saw in the chat that accidentally I even answered a question there. That's good. Okay. So perhaps if we get back to talent mediation, I would be really interested to know your take on this, and maybe Pauline also in terms of what you've experienced.
Tuukka, you want to go first?
Yeah.
Like that,
I mean that's a wonderful question. Of course, at first, the first thing I would do is, of course, I'd be a little bit critical of the language of maximizing value, because obviously this vocabulary comes from conventional business and sort of from an economistic mindset. So first I would say that, okay, look, there's many ways to kind of expand to different directions, and you sort of have to set this direction. We talked about this before, how it's a dialogue with your users, with your stakeholders and all that. So there's no one way to maximize value, obviously, or to grow into one direction. So it's a very multidimensional picture, and I think talent mediation is can be a huge part of it. Of course, don't have a really sort of I wouldn't have a very sort of ultimate, huge, big, or well thought out answer. I could try to provide a very tangible example, or a very practical example. If I was managing or co-managing a space, maybe in London or in Berlin or in Tokyo, I would perhaps first look at those members who are on the verge of leaving the space. So I would focus on sort of maximizing the value they're experiencing, because that's where you can make a huge difference, hopefully fairly quickly. So it could be an issue of them not being connected to other members, to other talented members. It could be something else, but I would go and investigate. And it's similar, actually, if you look to many of our countries, in usual times at least, like when we look at the field of happiness studies, a lot of people, or a lot of academics, have ended up focusing on those who are most depressed, right? Because there's a huge deficit in happiness, right? So if you're able to help some of those people, then you raise overall levels of happiness. So in a similar analogous way, if you're able to focus on the folks who are not experiencing value, then you're able to raise your overall levels of value production quite significantly. So that would be a nice, I think, practical thing to do. So I'll stop right there for now. I think we can keep hearing a bit more from Pauline. Yeah.
I mean, from our perspective, because co-working, as I was introducing on the first day of Co-working Online, it's a job board targeted at the co-working industries and at co-working communities. So companies that sit in co-working spaces also use it to hire people. And for me, this is also where the value stands, because it means that the workspace matters, the work environment you provide matters to people that look for jobs. So whenever you look for a job right now, you do not just consider the offer itself, you also consider what comes around it. And when you enter a co-working space, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, you suddenly enter something that is way bigger than just a workplace, because you get access to education through all the events that are organized, but also through the people that sit in that space and that can teach you many things, be it like a drawing, illustration, coding, I mean, even finance, like law, whatever, you can learn so much. And you have access to networking opportunities. Tuukka, you said a lot throughout this conversation about the well-being, which I think co-working spaces are really pushing forward for well-being of their members. We actually had a speaker on Thursday night. She was talking a lot about this also, that, you know, co-working spaces, they have, since they exist, they have actually pushed the normal companies and the regular offices to innovate, and everybody has been looking at what co-working spaces are doing. For instance, taking the role of community managers and trying to implement it in their own company. So for me, this is also where the value stands, you know, like when you create a job that becomes so necessary to connect the people and to really re-emphasize or strengthen the links between everybody that interact in that space. And with the job board, we really see that working in a co-working space is not working, it's not like working in a regular company. There is like so much more that people, be it a co-working team. So if you manage the space as a community manager, an event manager, operational manager, or even you as a member when you join a co-working space, all the opportunities you create for yourself, they are so much more than if you would not be in a co-working space.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely agree with Pauline. And actually, what you're signaling or what you're pointing towards seems to be about unlocking the resources of the community, right? So you're not just saying, here's a hospitality business and we can hand it off the shelf. So here's a benefit that we take and we give it to you off the shelf. No, you have to access it through the community and you have to unlock the resources of the community. But that's a process. I think the important thing and valuable thing for managers, and obviously every manager understands this in an intuitive way, but there's, I think it would be very productive and healthy in most cases to say, you know, what is the process for us to unlock these community resources? And unfortunately, there are a lot of some spaces at least, who put obstacles in the way of these community resources. And some of the, well, especially in highly commercialized areas like London, you know, there are a lot of spaces that view themselves as very commercial services. And therefore, they do things that can disincentivize giving, or they disincentivize member-to-member interactions. Or they're very top-down in certain cases. So it's good to be honest about situations where these community resources are being blocked. And then we have to figure out what are the sort of incentives, or how do we keep the intrinsic motivation of members alive? And we've had long discussions with Lucy, whom I just mentioned a moment ago, about how certain operators, they can kind of stand in between you and the other members, and they kind of dampen your desire to take initiative. So if you wanted to run an event, they would say, no, let's not do it now. Or if you wanted to test a product or whatnot, they would have hurdles or red tape. So on a more positive, if you put it more positively, I guess it's great if we can think about the process that really leads to unleashing those resources. And that's where there's a tension. That's the final point. And there's a huge tension between the really commercialized, you know, models of the big actors and then the smaller ones, because the smaller ones are quite comfortable with this notion of community and really celebrating community even, right? But the bigger ones, it's not really in their vocabulary, and they have their own policies and ways of doing things. So they sort of, because they over commercialize things, they end up undermining this desire and ability to share resources. So yeah, that's a bigger debate, but I would love to have more discussions on that process that can lead to these resources to being shared.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I also have to say that I think that those that perhaps have a more commercial focus and they don't want to have that as much, I think that works in the same way, simply because their member base is perhaps not as interested in that. They're looking for, say, a prestigious office. They can invite clients, make a great impression, and that's all they want, which is great. So I think what we are thinking more about is this idealistic understanding of co-working and the things that we love so much. But I think to get back to what Pauline was also saying, from an HR perspective, it's important to see co-working spaces functioning as really a human talent pool. You co-locate so many talented people, and it's about trying to connect them in a sense that makes sense for them. And I think that's where, for instance, a job board comes in very handy, because they are essentially able to perhaps also discover new things that they were always trying to go into for, but they have not been able to do so yet. But in a sense, and I know it sounds a bit mechanical, we call this talent extraction, where essentially talented members in a space are being sourced, both by members in that particular space, actually, as well as by external companies. And I think this is also something that was mentioned in the chat here, where recruitment agencies or perhaps other companies, they are perhaps tapping into this talent pool as well. And it's then, and I think that's one of the key questions here, is also to what extent a co-working space wants that. I think that providing these opportunities for members and kind of staying within that community is something that is generally very desired. But to what extent they open up also for external companies, investors, accelerators, and so I think is something that the co-working space needs to decide for themselves, depending on how they understand themselves as well in terms of their role, really.
Just to wrap up the conversation, a lot of what we've been discussing also to me seems like added value in co-working comes down to human value. So like the value added by the people that sit in that space, or that use that space, or that created that space. What's your take on that? Or would you agree to that? Or would you see it in a different way? So yeah, the human value of co-working.
I would see it in a way that a co-working space comes down to its people. You can take away the space, the physical space, but it's always the people, the member base that's there. I wouldn't necessarily call it human value. I think it's the value that is created by humans as the actors. So it's what they do rather than them themselves. So in that case, I would almost sign it, just that the human is actually what comes before the value being added. But other than that, I fully agree.
Yeah, no, they're very. I think there's sort of a spirit in many co-working spaces that amplifies the good side of being in the human community. So I totally agree with that kind of experiential side of having a kind of a mood and a sort of collegiality that many companies actually lack. So I suppose many of us and many of those listening to this first sort of became inspired by co-working because they saw that there's a more direct human connection that's possible, that is actually not happening in other workplaces. And why is that? Because we are able to relate as individuals who are not in the same sort of hierarchy. Because if you're working for the same company, you have your respective positions, you may be competing, maybe arguing over the same resources, but now you're brought into a co-working space, so you're able to sort of be a sort of pure individual. You talk about your hobbies as much as you talk about your work, and you can let down your guard a bit more. So I think there's a very strong kind of aspect that at its best can bring out the sort of good side of human interactions. But I would also agree with Manuel to kind of say that it's not so helpful just to say that it's human value, although it's a big part of it, it's a precondition. It's more helpful to break it down and be a bit more precise about where the value comes from. For instance, if you're running a survey, a diagnostic, I would recommend most spaces to ask their members about, okay, in times of trouble, when you're running into a business problem or a technical problem, can you think of 3 or 4 other members who you could just call up anytime, who you could rely upon? So I would test the connections in the community. I wouldn't just, I would love to celebrate the community spirit and how wonderful it is, and often it is great, but I would then test, can you find help when you most need that help, and do you get well-being benefits? When do you get them? And do you get the right introductions when you need them? Do you have enough of a network? Do you have a path to those benefits? So yes, human, but when possible, let's be specific about it. That's my position, I guess.
Thank you so much, Tuukka. I think it's a great conclusion to our conversation. We had questions and comments coming out, but Manuel actually answered them when discussing. So the person that you answered the question to said, thank you, Manuel, just answer my question. Talent mediation is the word I was searching for. So it's great that we even answered questions while before we take them. Before I close down, I wrap up the talk, I would love, as I've been doing with everybody, to take a selfie with the two of you, because we are not in the same place, but I can still take a screenshot to get a memory of our discussion. So give me your best smile. 1, 2, 3. Done. Thank you so much to both of you. If anybody watching this is interested to connect with you, what's the best way to either look at your research or even just connect with you and keep the conversation going?
Please feel free to connect on LinkedIn or on ResearchGate. Just type my name there and you will find me for sure.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I just tweeted something about this event a while ago, so you can find me there. You can just or you can just email me and find my website as well.
So for all the people who are participating to Coworking, I actually added your LinkedIn, both of you, into the participant welcome kit that you received. So don't hesitate to add Tuukka and Manuel on LinkedIn to keep the conversation going. And as Manuel said, you can also check their research on ResearchGate. Thank you, Tuukka. Thank you, Manuel, once again for such a great conversation. I was really happy to have you, and I was really happy also to close the event with both of you. I wish you to have a nice weekend, and I hope we can see each other in real life very soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Pauline. It's been a huge pleasure, and I'm very happy to be part of this. And I'm super curious for the outcomes, actually, of the teams. So
yeah, keep an eye on this channel, 145. There is the first team pitching.
I will for sure.
It's been a delight. Thank you so much, Pauline and Dimitar.
Thank you, Tuukka.
Yeah. Cheers. Take care.
See you guys. Bye.